All right, guys, we're back with another video on the Unit 4 notes. So when we left off last, we were talking about the tragedy of the commons. Feel free to go back to that previous video to review that. Not going to spend time really reviewing. The next concept, sorry about that. The next concept we have to talk about are externalities. Externalities are the unintended consequences we have from using or producing something. And they can either be a benefit or they could be a harm with it. So it could be either benefit, which is going to be a positive externality, or it could be a drawback, which is harm to the ecosystem or harm to the environment in some way. These would be our negative externalities. So again, think about it as like an unintended consequence. The example that I like to think about are Christmas trees. So if you've ever been to a place that you cut your own Christmas tree, you know that up in Indiana, PA, they have these really steep hillsides that have these trees growing on them, and they grow tons and tons of these trees. Just trees for acres and acres and acres. We cut those trees down to put in our house, decorate them at Christmas time. So these trees are grown for the sole purpose of providing us enjoyment and entertainment around the holiday season. We then take them off, put our ornaments on, all that stuff. But we're getting far more benefit than just that enjoyment. We're getting, for instance, CO2 that's being absorbed into those Christmas trees as they're growing. So by planting more Christmas trees, we're drawing more carbon dioxide out of the sky. We're also having oxygen production happening at that same time. So we're releasing oxygen up into the sky. Both of those would be positive externalities. In addition to that, we're growing them on a very steep hillside. So if they weren't there, that hillside could experience a higher rate of erosion. With the pine trees in place, the root systems start to grow and they start to stabilize that hillside. It acts kind of like a mesh that soil grows with or exists within, and that mesh kind of holds it in place. So we'd have reduced erosion rates. All of those are going to be, again, positive externalities. So when we look at it, we don't intend to plant the Christmas trees to absorb carbon dioxide, to release oxygen, to stabilize hillsides from eroding, but we gain benefit out of them for that purpose, or because of that reason, rather. So that's going to be some positive externalities with it. When we look at the negative externalities, those are the harms that we don't associate with the production of that good or service. So this is where we tend to focus on in the environment, because a lot of the things that we buy, they're not charging the true cost of production. They're charging what the cost is that the user will pay for it. For instance, a lot of people have those little pop sockets on the back of their phone. Those pop sockets might be $5. The $5 pop socket, they always talk about how it only takes 30 cents to produce them, but they're charging $5 for them. They're charging $5 because they want to make profit. You don't take into account the distribution costs, the advertising, the packaging, all those other things. Those aren't necessarily externalities in themselves. What we're looking at is the cost of production, they say, is 50 cents, right? However, that doesn't include everything that goes into that production of that pop socket. We're not including into this the respiratory problems caused by the pollution released. Uh, so let's say that you're an asthmatic or you have chronic bronchitis. As they're making these pop sockets, they're going to be using fossil fuels, and they're going to be having vapors from and chemicals from the plastics that they're melting being released up into the atmosphere. As you breathe those in, that's going to give us more of a risk of having those respiratory problems. So, the respiratory issues might result in, say, 3,000 people going to the hospital that year. They're not taking into account the dollars associated with going to the hospital, getting treated for those respiratory illnesses. It may release chemicals into the water, maybe not in toxic levels, but it may kill off some fish. So it may kill fish from water pollution. They're not taking into account terrible spelling here. So that water pollution that killed the fish, they're not taking into account those dead fish when they're looking at that 50-cent production cost. This is going to be an actual cost, not a true cost. We hardly ever charge the true cost of production. So these would be the negative externalities associated with producing that pop socket we're not including those into the cost of goods and services. We're charging an actual cost, not a true cost. If we had true cost pricing, now we would take into account the value of the hospital visits, the value of the fish that were killed, and even if it was something like the Christmas tree farms, the benefit we receive from the oxygen production, the benefit we receive from the lack of soil erosion. So the actual cost might be $30 for a Christmas tree, but they really should be charging, maybe 70 or $80 by the time they factor in all the other externalities associated with it. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Again, there are going to be positives and negatives. We tend to focus on the negatives because those are the ones causing the environmental harm. So those are going to have some sort of cost, but we don't ever pay that cost because we're not charging that included into the price of the goods and services. Probably one of the best examples to look at it would be automobiles. When we start buying these electric vehicles, Teslas and the hybrids like Priuses, they have to mine for the metals that are used within the battery systems. Those metals are mined for, and there's a huge amount of environmental damage done. If it's some chemical or some metal that we're using heat bleaching for instance, there's going to be a huge amount of potential for acid spills and potential for corrosive chemicals to get out into the environment. There's going to be a lot of pollution associated with it because we have to use fossil fuels in the process to crush the ore up and to transport the ore from the mine site to the refinery. There's going to be environmental damage, but we're not charging the cost of those damages uh, to the consumer through purchasing that car. So the Tesla, for instance, might be say $40,000, right? But that $40,000, again, that's not including the environmental harm involved in producing the batteries and producing the tires and producing the wiring and all that stuff. It's just looking at what the consumer is willing to spend. The companies find a way to mass produce it. And again, the more production you have, the higher the quantity of output, the cheaper the price you can end up charging for because you're doing it on a larger scale. But we still need to take into account the environmental damage that we're causing. So that $40,000 price tag that's on the Tesla may seem steep, but it really probably should be closer to maybe $44,000 or $45,000 each, so that we could mitigate the effects of those negative externalities. Now we would have that extra $4,000 to put towards ecosystem restoration or towards cleaning up the pollution from the spills, all those different types of things. But consumers aren't willing to spend that extra money, so they don't include those because nobody's requiring them to include those in the price of it. So that's going to be the talk on externalities. The next thing that we have to look at, if you guys want to go back when you look at this, you can list two negatives and two positives. If you want to bring them into me, feel free to bring them into me. I can go over with you, see if you're true in what those externalities are, if you're correct or incorrect with it. Hold on one second, I got some lights on. We have these wonderful eco light systems here at school that turn the lights off after a few minutes of inactivity. So I had to go back and turn the lights on. So the last thing we're going to talk about as far as resource usage goes is the maximum sustainable yield. And this is going to be true of any renewable resource. Any renewable resource will have a maximum sustained yield. It's the amount that can be harvested without compromising future availability. So anything that's a renewable resource will have a maximum amount we can use each year where we're not impacting the future availability of it. For instance, trees. We can cut down a certain number of trees every year, and we're not going to impact the size of our forests for the future because there's going to be regrowth happening each year. Fresh water we can use as a renewable resource. We can consume X amount of fresh water because there's going to be purification happening as it percolates down through the ground, and that fresh water is going to replace itself. Any renewable resource will have a maximum sustained yield. The amount that that maximum sustained yield is varies case by case. It's going to be dependent on how quickly the resource is replenished, how quick the replenishment rate is. So something that's going to take, say, 30 years to grow, like a tree, that's going to have a much lower maximum sustained yield than something like fresh water that might be reproducing, a few hundred gallons in a pond every single day. So we're going to have a much higher maximum sustainable yield for the water than what we do for the forests. So when we look at what it is to estimate how much we can use, we usually look at what the carrying capacity is. So usually when we look at the carrying capacity, we can support X amount of organisms in an area. If we take half of that, that tends to give us our maximum sustainable yield. It's not always that, but it's going to be a general rule of thumb with it. Because what happens is that half the carrying capacity tends to be right in this area. And this is where the population grows at its biotic potential. And hopefully you guys remember what biotic potential is. Biotic potential is the maximum rate of growth for a population. Because again, it assumes that there's an unlimited amount of resources available to it. So when we're in here, we have our maximum growth rate right at that biotic potential. It's growing at its maximum rate because we have more than enough food, more than enough shelter, mates, water supplies. All those biotic and abiotic conditions that it takes to keep them alive are in excess at that point. So we have more than enough to support a fast growing population. If we're harvesting right at that in that biotic potential, when we take those out of the population, new ones are being replaced at a very, very quick rate. If we were to set our maximum sustainable yield up here, where we look at this population that we're removing from the ecosystem, there's no way that that little bit that's left over before you get to the carrying capacity is going to reproduce fast enough to replace itself. It's too slow of a growth rate to replace. We want to make sure we're harvesting it within that fast growth rate area. We don't want to take out this little bit here because then we're going to have too little taken out of the population. It's not bad to take out too little, but we can harvest at a higher rate and still have the same impact on it. So, we're going to be affecting the ecosystem here too by harvesting a little bit. Why not harvest at the maximum sustained yield? Because it's just going to replace itself anyway. And again, usually what we look at is half of that carrying capacity. And again, the carrying capacity is the maximum population that can be supported with the resources in the area at the given time. Sorry, my nose is a little bit stuffy today. Now, don't forget also, our population usually fluctuates above and below that carrying capacity because it's not a fixed value. That's usually an average carrying capacity that's represented with that dotted line. So when we look at it, we'll look at the average maximum population we can support. If we cut that in half, that's usually going to be the maximum sustainable yield for a resource. And any renewable resource has one of those maximum sustainable yields. Right? I guess we can tie this in because we still have a little bit more time. I tried to keep these to about 15 minutes, but this will kind of lead us into our talk on agriculture. When we were talking about maximum sustainable yield and tragedy of the commons and all those other things, we look at our long-term threat or our long-term harm to the environment. A guy named Thomas Malthus, late 1700s, came up with this theory that said the writing's on the wall for a major catastrophe. Our food production is growing linearly, and that linear food production is going to be eventually outpaced by our population size. They could see even back in Europe in the late 1700s, they started to see that exponential growth of our population. So we had an exponentially growing population size, but our linear food growth wasn't keeping pace with that population growth. He said we're eventually going to get to a point where the two intersect and we start having people die off because of starvation. Because now we don't have the food necessary to feed that population. Down in here, we had an excess of food because our population was below our production rate. Now up here, our population is way above our production rate. We're going to have a deficiency and we're going to have starvation occur. So we had to take into account we didn't want people to die. We didn't want people to starve. So we had to find a way to fix that potential problem. We had to find a way either to reduce population size or increase food production. We know that we're not going to try to have genocide and try to reduce our population size. However, Malthus was one of the proponents, not necessarily of genocide, but of reducing population sizes through not allowing certain people to breed in a population. If you were illiterate, if you were poor or destitute, then you weren't allowed to mate according to his ideas, because he said that's a way that we could take, instead of increasing our food production, we could take our population growth and match that food production with it, take it from being exponential into more of an arithmetic or linear growth. We don't want to do that. We want to allow people to have babies as they choose. We want to provide birth control options and birth spacing and all that stuff that makes it healthy, but we want to find a way to do that without limiting people's choices. So instead of limiting the population size, we chose to find a way to increase that food production from being arithmetic or linear into that exponential also. And we did that through the Green Revolution. Right? We did basically overhauled our farming systems. We started mechanizing. We started to grow monocrops. where we were planting a single crop over an entire vast amount of space. We had synthetic fertilizers available to us. We had better pesticides, better strains of seed through genetic modification or through artificial selection. So by doing all those things coupled together, we were able to drastically increase our food production. So right now, we're currently producing enough food to make sure everybody would have enough calories on the planet to survive. We're not getting to that point. We still have hunger and we still have starvation because we're not distributing those calories equally. The rich people are getting more access to it than the poor people, for instance. So if you're in an impoverished country, you're still seeing this Malthusian catastrophe play in because the food isn't just available to them. They don't have the money to go out and buy it. So their population's far above their production of food. So through the Green Revolution, we were able to fix that globally. Now we need to fix the problem of unequal distribution of it. And we'll get into that as we go through the rest of the notes. And hopefully you guys understood what we talked about today. Again, maximum sustainable yield, externalities, and just the intro into the Malthusian catastrophe. We'll talk about how we prevent that through agricultural practices here in a bit.